Discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Now, unlike our previous review, which offered a more focused analysis, this feature, well, it delivers a comprehensive overview. We'll be tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject. If you appreciate this expanded format and find it helpful, please let us know. Your feedback really does help shape future content. So let's start with the central kind of provocative question that really drives this investigation. What happens when you have concentrated, ultra-wealthy financial power, highly targeted propaganda, and intense religious fervor all aligning toward a single long-term political goal, specifically the systematic erosion of American democratic norms? We aren't just talking about standard lobbying here. We're looking at a really organized movement detailed across 15 years of investigative work.
Exactly. And that organization is the focus of Katherine Stewart's 2025 nonfiction release, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. This is really hard-hitting investigative journalism. Sociopolitical analysis, too. It's actually the third book in her influential series, looking at that intersection of religion, wealth, and far-right politics. She presents a pretty sustained argument that this coalition she describes is actively advocating for autocratic principles.
Okay, let's really unpack this then with some depth. Our mission today is to give you a comprehensive, fact-based summary of Stewart's findings. We want to detail the operational structures, the core motivations behind this movement she describes, really aiming to give you a deep understanding of the sophisticated mechanisms she documents. And just before we dive deeper, please remember, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM, designed for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
So, when Stewart sets the historical stage, she's really focusing on the 2 decades surrounding the 2010s. This wasn't just a randomly polarized time. It was an era marked by really landmark changes, things like campaign finance law shifts, economic instability, and, importantly, a massive escalation in religious and political activism. This environment, she argues, created kind of the perfect conditions for wealthy donors to fund this cohesive anti-democratic project.
Right, and crucially, this isn't just high-level theorizing, is it? The book's scope, it relies heavily on ground-level reporting. Stewart traveled extensively. You mentioned she embedded herself in conferences, religious gatherings, strategy sessions.
Exactly. She was documenting how religious rhetoric and political activism were blending in all sorts of settings, both urban and rural. She makes a case that this growing distrust in democratic norms wasn't just spontaneous, it was strategically cultivated.
Okay, so if we connect that to the bigger picture, what's the book's core claim boiled down?
Synthesized very clearly, yeah. It's that these influential coalitions made up of ultra-wealthy donors, powerful think tanks, and certain far-right religious organizations are systematically working to undermine democratic institutions. And often, they're doing it under the cover of things like religious liberty or fiscal conservatism.
That structural synthesis feels key. Stewart organizes her findings around those 3 pillars in the title, right? Money, lies, and God. To really grasp the mechanism, we probably need to break those down.
Let's start with the engine, the economic side, money. Stewart dedicates 4 early chapters specifically to mapping out this financial ecosystem. The focus is definitely in the sheer concentration of wealth among these elite donors, but she also emphasizes their heterogeneity, which is maybe surprising.
Yeah, that heterogeneity seems really crucial. It's not just one single group pulling the strings. Stewart documents that these funders include, yes, powerful evangelicals, but also deeply conservative Catholics, entirely secular billionaires, and even, in some cases, Jewish donors. The point she makes is that they coalesce around a shared political agenda, maybe not always a shared theology.
Precisely. And that agenda often looks quite similar. Supporting deregulation, pushing for massive tax cuts for the wealthy, ensuring judicial appointments that favor corporate power. Stewart documents how this happens through sophisticated dark money contribution methods, foundation grants that kind of shield donor identities, direct funding to think tanks. These think tanks then provide the intellectual justification. She shows funds flowing into these networks that clearly prioritize economic liberty over, say, democratic stability.
The scale sounds staggering, and that money, it must directly fuel the second pillar she identifies, lies. How does Stewart show that connection, the money translating into propaganda?
Well, the next 3 chapters document these massive disinformation campaigns. This is where you see the allied think tanks, this whole network of social media influencers and conservative media outlets really working together. What's fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is that the goal isn't just winning the next election cycle. It seems to be about shifting the entire political, maybe even epistemological foundation for the public.
So it's about constructing narratives then. Manufactured narratives. Stewart details how these efforts are designed to, what, amplify existing cultural and racial grievances, intentionally heighten tensions.
Yes, exactly, and encourage widespread conspiracy thinking among parts of the public. This generates a kind of emotional buy-in. It makes voters more receptive to anti-democratic rhetoric because they might already feel like victims, like the system is rigged against them.
Which leads us to the third pillar, God. Although the book sometimes frames this as demons or demonization, right?
That's right. The final 4 chapters trace how religious communities are mobilized and how specific types of religious rhetoric get weaponized. Stewart is careful to define what she means by Christian nationalism, not just devout personal faith, but the political ideology asserting the U.S. was, and should remain, a divinely ordained Christian nation.
And this is where the language Stewart documents gets really existential.
Extremely. She documents the explicit use of religious rhetoric, specifically invoking spiritual warfare, talking about demonic forces, to not just oppose political opponents, but to actively stigmatize and frankly dehumanize them. It transforms basic political disagreement into this existential, moral, or even religious combat. And that, in turn, justifies extreme actions in the minds of some followers.
That transformation sounds like the key mechanism she identifies for uniting factions that might otherwise have little in common, like the secular billionaire and the local pastor.
Exactly, uniting them under this single moral banner of fighting evil.
Okay, so if money, lies, and God are the conceptual pillars, the book then moves into the operational architecture, the people who actually make this system run.
Yes. Stewart identifies 5 key actor types that keep appearing throughout her investigation. She really emphasizes the sophisticated, coordinated structure of this movement.
Let's look at those roles. First, you have the funders. We've touched on them, the financial backbone. Includes both secular and religious billionaires supporting these anti-democratic organizations, often with very little public transparency.
Then come the thinkers. These are the intellectuals, often based in conservative think tanks, and their job is basically to create the ideological frameworks and the propaganda. Stewart specifically mentions figures like John Eastman from the Claremont Institute as a prominent example. These thinkers take raw grievance and translate it into sophisticated-sounding legal or historical arguments. They provide that philosophical justification for anti-democratic policies, especially things like challenging election integrity.
Got it. So funders provide the cash, thinkers provide the theory. Below them are the sergeants.
Right. These are the really effective, on-the-ground activists and organizers. Stewart documents their deep ties, often organizational ties, to religious grassroots networks. They're the ones responsible for galvanizing local communities, coordinating demonstrations, leading very focused actions, think things like local school board takeovers, pushing for specific curriculum changes, or library book challenges.
That local action sounds critical because it mobilizes the next group Stewart identifies, the infantry.
Yes. The rank-and-file supporters,
Yeah.
conservative voters, self-identified Christian nationalists, core Trump supporters. Stewart details their massive participation in rallies, their activity in community-level politics, and importantly, their responsiveness to those grievance-based narratives that are filtered down from the sergeants.
And finally, tying it all together are the power players.
The political leaders, elected officials, influential advisors, these are the brokers. They mediate between the wealthy funders, the intellectual thinkers, and the grassroots infantry. They ensure those policy proposals actually get advocated for in state capitals and on Capitol Hill.
Wow, so it's a really complex architecture she describes. It allows the movement to operate at the elite funding level, the intellectual level, and the grassroots level all at once.
It's truly a top-to-bottom operation, as she lays it out. And maybe this is a good spot for a brief pause just to mention that Mindful Moments is our YouTube channel. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques there, all aimed at inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Okay, good reminder. Now, let's look at some of the pivotal developments the book documents, the things that show this strategy in action. Stewart highlights the constant formation and intense funding of new conservative think tanks, ones dedicated entirely to challenging previously accepted democratic norms, often masking political goals in academic language.
She also digs into major political conferences, things like the Faith and Freedom Coalition events or CPAC. She presents them not just as public rallies, but as detailed strategic planning sites. Places where funders meet power players, where thinkers share their latest ideological frameworks directly with the sergeants who will implement them.
And the effects become visible in policy pushes, right? The book extensively documents systematic attempts to erode voting rights and also coordinated efforts to infiltrate public education systems.
Yes, absolutely. And these efforts are almost invariably justified using that language of religious liberty or parental rights, which she argues masks the underlying political goal of institutional control.
You mentioned rhetoric earlier. Stewart traces an escalation.
Yes, she finds the escalation of rhetoric particularly compelling. Over the last decade especially, she traces a shift away from just policy disagreement towards labeling political opponents as demonic or enemies of God and country. This rhetoric, sometimes preached directly from pulpits, fuels these major strategic alliances between groups that honestly might have had zero common ground previously.
Let's talk about the specific institutional targets she focuses on in the investigation. Public education infiltration is one.
Yes, attempts to reshape curricula systematically. Then there are relentless attempts to restrict voting rights, powerful lobbying efforts around deregulation, and also calculated, long-term attempts to undermine the independence of the court system through judicial nominations and sustained public criticism. Science education policy is another area she touches on.
And how does she back this up? From a journalistic standpoint, what's the evidence base?
Well, the book's authority really rests on the technical and documentary evidence Stewart gathered over those 15 years. She uses primary source documents, things like foundation grant records, detailed position papers from think tanks, records detailing the methods of dark money contributions, evidence showing sophisticated manipulation of social media platforms to spread these narratives. It's quite extensive.
And the writing style itself, how is it presented?
It's presented in a third-person journalistic voice, largely chronological, relying heavily on factual exposition and reported speech from public forums, from interviews she conducted. It's really built on showing the evidence, not just stating an interpretation. It lets you, the listener, see exactly how this infrastructure seems to operate according to her findings.
Which brings us back to the core themes, the big takeaways for you, the learner. Stewart fundamentally demonstrates four major points, wouldn't you say?
I think so. First, the profoundly destabilizing role of concentrated, often undisclosed wealth in our political system. Second, the calculated, organized spread of misinformation specifically designed to fracture civic trust.
Third, that complete fusion of a specific kind of religious rhetoric, what she calls Christian nationalism, with anti-democratic political strategies.
And finally, fourth, the sheer urgency she conveys about defending democratic protections against this highly organized and incredibly well-funded opposition. And maybe as we close, here's a final provocative thought that Stewart meticulously documents.
Despite the really profound philosophical differences, between a secular billionaire obsessed with low taxes and a religious fundamentalist organizer focused on social purity, this coalition she describes is remarkably adept at overcoming its internal conflicts. They consistently manage to align, to focus their collective efforts on cultivating public suspicion, suspicion towards democratic government itself, and suspicion towards rational, fact-based inquiry.
That is indeed the complex and frankly unsettling reality Stewart presents in the book. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth book summary. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique, and please subscribe, share, consider purchasing via the link, and always think rationally.
And don't forget to see the many genre-based book podcasts over at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.